Hello there, Gora Rader here from philosophyintrocourse.com. Today we're talking about Judith Jarvis Thomson's essay, A Defense of Abortion. So this is an essay that's included in most introduction to ethics classes, but it's also very confusing, so we're going to try and sort out some of that in a little video here. So there's some notes here that I'm going to be running through. These notes are online. The link is below in the description box if you're not on that page. If you are on the page, the notes are below. The title of the essay is A Defense of Abortion. It's a slightly misleading title because the article is far from a full-fledged defense of abortion. She defends abortion in some limited circumstances, 3 different circumstances. We'll talk about those. And also, it's not as much a defense of abortion as it is sort of an exploration of the relationship between 2 things. She's exploring the relationship between the rights of a fetus and the rights of a mother. She doesn't necessarily think that fetuses have a right to life, but she's sort of assuming that they do for the sake of the argument, just to try and show that even if fetuses do have a right to life, in some instances abortion is still going to turn out to be morally permissible. The notable and somewhat confusing thing about this essay is all the different thought experiments she uses, so we'll try and run through some of the main ones. The main one being the Violinist experiment. That's the most famous one. Okay, so here is a reconstruction of her argument against abortion. She thinks this is like the standard argument. Premise 1, every person has a right to life. Excuse me. Okay, premise 1, every person has a right to life. Premise 2, fetus is a person. Premise 3, so the fetus has a right to life. Standard logical syllogism. From that logical syllogism, the conclusion that's supposed to follow is abortion infringes on the rights of a fetus and therefore is impermissible. So this is what she takes to be the standard argument against abortion. It moves pretty straightforwardly from the idea that a fetus is a person to the idea that abortion is not morally permissible. But what she suggests is that there is a suppressed premise needed to make the argument work. And what she says that suppressed premise is the 4th premise in this next argument. The fetus's right to life is stronger than the mother's right to bodily integrity, right? So it's not enough to say that the fetus has a right to life, but we also need to say that the fetus's right to life is stronger than the mother's right, because the mother has certain rights too. She has a right to use her own body as she sees fit, right? So there's a sort of tension between these 2 sets of rights. So how do we resolve the tension? Now, people who think abortion is wrong, they're going to sort of dismiss the mother's right to bodily integrity as being obviously inferior to the fetus's right to life. Having a right to life is sort of the strongest right you can have. So there's some logic to that, but it also makes sense to think that there's some circumstances in which that's not always the case. So let's examine what some of those are going to be. And that's what this essay is entitled. This paper is dedicated to examining this 4th premise, the relationship between the fetus's right to life and the mother's right to bodily integrity. Okay. So the main argument of this paper is that the right to life is not an absolute right, and therefore in some cases abortion is morally permissible. Here's a quote: "I'm arguing only that having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the use of or the right to the continued use of another's body, even if one needs it for life itself." Okay, so as I mentioned, she doesn't necessarily think the fetus is a person, but she assumes it for the sake of the argument. One of the very useful things about this article is that it helps us to think, or forces us to think about what morality demands we do for other people. That's sort of in the background of this essay. How far do moral obligations go? What do we have to give other people to sort of support their life? Things like that. So another way of thinking about the topic, the more extensive one's obligations to others, the less permissible abortion becomes, and conversely, the less extensive one's obligation to others, the more permissible it becomes. So one way of thinking about this essay is that she's arguing there's a contradiction between two claims. Women do not have a right to an abortion, and people do not have extensive and enforceable duties to help others. So we don't normally go around thinking we have to make gigantic sacrifices to help other people, even if it means keeping them alive. We don't think you have to give money to homeless people, or that if someone's homeless, you have to let them live with you, or something like that. Or if someone needs an organ, you have to give them your organ. But she's sort of saying, well, that's what people are assuming when they think abortion is wrong in all cases. Okay, so let's look at some of the thought experiments. Famous one, the violinist. You wake up in the hospital with a famous violinist attached to your kidneys, and he needs your use of your kidneys for 9 months. So let's see how an argument works. Every person has a right to life. The violinist is a person. Therefore, the violinist has a right to life. So it is impermissible to unplug the violinist. Okay, so obviously notice the similarity to the previous argument. Fetus has just been replaced with violinist. But everyone who reads this, their intuitions tell them, no, that's wrong. I can unplug myself from the violinist. I don't have to stay hooked up for 9 months. Okay. Well, so here we have a case of a person's right to life. Violinist clearly has a right to life, but you have a right to bodily integrity. This is an example in which we think a right to bodily integrity trumps a right to life, so to speak. Okay. So, I think what this example, what this thought experiment shows is, yeah, there is some cases it looks like abortion is going to be morally permissible. Now, the violinist experiment is far from sort of the standard situation abortion. In the experiment, you were basically abducted and hooked up against your will to the violinist. So this example is more analogous to, say, getting an abortion in the case of a pregnancy that resulted from rape. But it does at least show that it does make sense to think there's some problem with the idea of a right to life always trumping a right to bodily integrity. So, just sort of getting over that initial hump, you might say, is a big deal. Like establishing that in some cases it does matter. Okay, so now we can begin to sort of unpack it, look further at it. Okay, what cases does it make sense to think that the rights of the mother trump the rights of the fetus? What case doesn't it? So that's a big difference from a blanket statement that the rights of the fetus always trump the rights of the mother. Okay, so then the middle portion of her paper discusses the idea of abortion in cases of danger to the mother's life. So she discusses what she calls an extreme view, where the child's right to life trumps the right to life of the mother. She runs through some different scenarios. You can take a look at the notes. She gives us a thought experiment. It says you're hooked up to the violinist and are told that you will die within a month, but that you are not permitted to unplug from the violinist. So the violinist needs you to stay plugged in, but you're told that if you stay plugged in, you will die. Can you unplug yourself from the violinist? Now again, there's a little bit of confusing intuitions there because in the previous violinist example, you were hooked up forcibly, but it seems clear that you don't have to stay plugged in, certainly not at the risk of your life. She has some other thought experiments on the topic. So this one is, you are trapped in a house with a rapidly growing child. If you not kill the child, it will kill you. Okay, so she thinks that you have a right to kill the child in self-defense. But she does also say, I'm not claiming that a person always has a right to do whatever they need to do to save their life. I think there are drastic limits to the right of self-defense. Then she says, a woman surely can defend her life against the threat to it posed by the unborn child, even if doing so involves its death. Okay, so she leaves open the bigger question, how far does the right to self-preservation go? But it does seem like under certain circumstances, there is certainly a right to self-defense. Another thought experiment, if Jones has found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, then it is not impartiality that says, I cannot choose between you, When Smith owns the coat, women have said again and again, this is my body. So in the case of a fetus who it poses a risk to the mother, the fetus is using the mother's body, and it seems like the mother has more of a right to her body than the fetus does, if you think about the fetus as being a separate entity with its own rights. Okay. Another thought experiment, this one's more broad. It's about what we have to do to help other people. She says, if I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same, I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. So what she's now getting at is the idea that just because we need something to live, it doesn't mean that someone else has the obligation to give it to us. I think this is a bad example because we probably do have the obligation to save someone's life if we can do it just by touching them. A more useful one might have been thinking in terms of organs. Say I need a new liver to survive. Do I have a right to half of someone else's liver or their whole liver or something like that? It doesn't look like I do, but in this example, probably Henry Fonda should touch my head if that will save me, because it's very minimal sacrifice from him. Okay. So what she suggests something regarding the right to life, which I think is one of the main points. She says, the right to life consists not in the right not to be killed, but rather in the right not to be killed unjustly. Right? So every citizen has a right to life, but it doesn't mean that you can't be put to death for committing a crime. It doesn't mean someone can't kill you in self-defense. It doesn't mean you can't be killed in war. So the right to life doesn't mean that you can't be killed under all circumstances. It just means you can't be killed unjustly. So the question then is, do we kill a violinist unjustly by plugging him in? No. Do we kill a fetus unjustly by getting an abortion? Well, bigger question. There's various types of abortions and circumstances, things like that. But I think the big point is that it's at least a question worth talking about, thinking about. She says, it is by no means enough to show that the fetus is a person and to remind us that all persons have a right to life. We need to be shown that also that killing a fetus violates its right to life, that abortion is unjust killing. And is it unjust killing? She says that indeed, in what pregnancy could it be supposed that the mother has given the unborn person such a right? Goes on to say, unborn persons whose existence is due to rape have no right to the use of their mother's bodies, and thus aborting them is not depriving them of anything they have a right to, and hence not unjust killing. But, she says, if a person engages in intercourse voluntarily, then aborting her would be more like the boys taking away the chocolates, that's an earlier example from the essay, and less like you're unplugging yourself from the violinist. Doing so would be depriving it of what it does have a right to, and thus would be doing it an injustice. So the idea there is something like if you engage in intercourse voluntarily, you have sort of invited the fetus or tacitly given it permission to use your body. If you've been raped, you have not given the fetus permission to use your body, and therefore you don't have any sort of obligation to allow the fetus to use your body. Okay, so the last couple experiments are a little more abstract and a little further from our reality, so it may be harder to think clearly about, but we'll go through them real quick. Number 6, if I open my window and a burglar climbs in, does that mean he is allowed to stay because I'm partly responsible for him being in the house, having full knowledge that a burglar might get in if I open the window? Then she says, what if I installed bars and windows, but a burglar got in because of a defect in the bars? So in these last couple thought experiments, she's thinking about abortion in the case of contraception, in a case where you have attempted to prevent the pregnancy. So she's thinking about the fetus as a burglar that sneaks in, even when you've tried to prevent it from getting in. And she thinks it kind of makes sense to think you haven't given the fetus permission to use your body. Although one might think, well, there's a kind of tacit permission that you're giving it that, well, I'm trying to prevent this, but if it happens, you have permission. So it's not a sort of lockdown case, but it's an interesting line of reasoning. The last one, which is similar, the weirdest one, people seeds. Imagine there are people seeds that drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your window, one may drift in and take root in your carpet or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, the very best you can buy, as can happen. However, on very rare occasions, and does happen, when the screens is defective, a seed takes root. Does the person plant who now develops have a right to the use of your house? Surely not, despite the fact you voluntarily opened your windows, you knowingly kept carpets and upholstered furniture, and you knew that screens were sometimes defective. Okay. She says, someone may argue you're responsible for the rooting, that the fetus does have a right to your house because, after all, you could have lived out your life with bare floors and furniture or sealed your windows and doors. But this won't do, for by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy, or anyway, never leaving their home without a reliable army. Okay. We won't get into thinking about the people seeds one. It's thought experiments are sort of harder and harder to evaluate the further away from everyday reality they get. It's a complicated one. But the point is she's trying to think about what it means to use contraception, and does contraception sort of strip the fetus of its right to existence, to its right to use your body. So the conclusion she draws: it seems to me that the argument we're looking at can establish at most that there are some cases in which the unborn person has a right to the use of its mother's body, and therefore some cases in which abortion is unjust killing. While I do not argue that abortion is not impermissible, I do not argue that it is always permissible. She says there may well be cases in which carrying the child to term requires only minimally decent Samaritanism of the mother, and this is a standard we must not fall below. So, then she also says a very early abortion is surely not the killing of a person, so it's not dealt with anything I've said here. Abortion's a big topic. A lot of complex arguments, a lot of things that could be said in response to these different arguments. The basic take-home point from the article, from the paper, should be, I believe, that we need to think carefully about this question of the mother's rights versus the fetus's rights. And I think she does successfully argue that even if the fetus is a person, it does not always have a right to life. And that getting an abortion is not always wrong, even if the fetus is a person. All right. So, what does she think she's proved? And we may think her argument's successful in one of these cases, or two, but maybe not the third, or maybe just the first, not the second or third. But she's arguing that abortion is permissible in three types of cases. One is rape, that was the violinist experiment. One is threat to the mother's life. She had a few different ones that talked about that. And then cases where attempts were made to prevent the pregnancy. So you may think the only one that really works is the rape one, or maybe you think the first two, rape and threat to mother's life, abortion's okay, but not the third. Or maybe you think her argument works for all three, or maybe none. But either way, it's a very interesting perspective on abortion, and certainly worth thinking about the relationship between the fetus's right to life and the mother's rights. And then again, assuming the fetus does have rights to life. She raises some broader, interesting questions. At the end of the paper, she says we must not fall below the standard of minimally decent Samaritanism. However, she never really says what that standard is. Is it true that we never have the obligation to save other people's lives? I think the Jane Fonda case, I think that's probably false. So how does that relate to some of the claims she makes? Interesting question. So yeah, a lot of interesting questions raised. Very interesting paper. A bit confusing, but also a good example of what types of things you can do in moral philosophy. All right, have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.